She said it into an open microphone, in front of 500 people, with a champagne flute, raised like the decision had already been made. To Colin, Jenna Harlow let the name sit there in the gilded air of the ballroom for a full, deliberate moment, for having the courage to follow his heart, wherever that may lead. And then she looked directly across the room at Marisol Drummond, and she smiled. Marisol didn't flinch. She didn't set down her wine glass. She didn't blink. Because Jenna Harlow had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of her professional life, and she was the only person in that room who didn't know it yet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your whole story, who looked at you and they saw surface, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know how far this one reaches. And if you haven't subscribed to Ivory Secrets yet, do it now, because this story is just getting started. Marisol Stanhope Drummond had known about the affair for 91 days. She hadn't stumbled across a text. She hadn't hired anyone. She had simply done what the women in her family had always done. From her grandmother, who had run a clinic in Sudbury with $30 and a borrowed stethoscope, quietly built the Stanhope Medical Group into the largest private hospital network in Ontario. She had paid attention. The signs had been small at first. The way Colin began taking calls in the garage. The way his lunch meetings started running past 7 in the evening, 3 nights a week, and then 4. The way he had begun using a particular word. Momentum. With an energy that was bright and slightly breathless when he talked about the Harlow file, though he never said her name more than once in any given conversation, as if saying it too often would make it visible. Marisol noticed. She catalogued. She said nothing. She came from a family that did not raise its voice. The Stanhopes operated on the principle that information was a currency, and the most dangerous thing you could do with currency was spend it before you knew exactly what you were buying. She had 3 months of information, and she knew precisely what she was going to buy with it. The night of the Stanhope Foundation annual healthcare gala began the way significant evenings in their world always did, with preparation that took hours and was designed to appear effortless. Marisol sat at her vanity in the Rosedale house at 4:30 in the afternoon while her stylist worked in silence. The gown had been chosen 5 days ago. Deep navy silk, structured at the shoulder, the kind of dress that read as composed rather than decorative. It was the right dress for a woman who intended to be remembered for something other than what she was wearing. Her assistant, Hannah, appeared in the doorway holding her tablet. The cars are confirmed for 7. Your family arrived at the Four Seasons this afternoon. Your father's already called the foundation office twice. A pause, measured and careful. Jenna Harlow is on the guest list tonight. She came in under the Drummond MedTech corporate block. The stylist's hands continued moving. Marisol's expression did not shift. Leave it exactly as it is, she said. Hannah gave one quiet nod and stepped back into the hall. She had been Marisol's assistant for 4 years. She had learned what leave it meant. It did not mean ignore. It meant that the situation had already been handled in ways that would only become visible later. Marisol looked at her own reflection. She thought about Colin, about the man she had married 11 years ago at her parents' estate in Muskoka, a summer afternoon that had smelled like cedar and lake water and everything that felt, at the time, like possibility. He had been 37, ambitious in a way that felt grounded rather than reckless, funny in private rooms, careful in professional ones. She had loved him. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, sitting alone in that room with the October light, leaving the city beyond her window. This was not a woman who had married for strategy and was now executing an exit. She had loved him. And she had watched, over the last 3 years, as the distance between who he had been and who he was choosing to become grew quietly, and then grew louder, and then became this: a name on a guest list, a champagne flute, an evening that was already decided before it began. She thought about the phone call from her brother Alistair 4 days ago. Everything is set. He had said it the way he said everything, without preamble, without softening. Alistair Stanhope had the family efficiency and their mother's instinct for the precise moment to move. Dad's already spoken to the licensing board. The moment you give the word, the renewal review for Drummond Medtech's Ontario operating certificate gets flagged for a compliance audit. That alone delays the Vancouver expansion by 8 months minimum. Not yet, Alistair. Marisol. Not yet, I'll know when. He had been quiet for a moment. She could picture him at his desk. At the firm, jacket off, thinking through the angles the way their father had taught them both. You're sure he's going to do something public? He stopped being careful 3 weeks ago. She had said it evenly. Men who stop being careful do it in rooms. He'll make it a room. Okay, a pause, I'll be there. You and Dad both, and Mum. Mum already said yes before I finished the sentence. That conversation had been 96 hours ago. And now here was Marisol, stepping out of the town car in front of the Fairmont at 7:23, the October. Air sharp and clean off the lake, Colin's hand at the small of her, back in that automatic performative way that long-married people maintained past the point of meaning. Old habits. They kept them the way they kept furniture they no longer liked, because rearranging felt like admitting something. The ballroom was everything it was designed to be. 500 people, round tables, with white linen, centerpieces of pale orchids and low candlelight, the Stanhope Foundation crest projected in soft gold above the stage at the far end. This was her family's event in the most literal sense. Her father had chaired this foundation for 19 years. Her name was on the endowment wall. The healthcare workers being honored tonight. Nurses, researchers, from Unity Inting Director, and the Prairies were there because Rupert Stanhope had decided they should be. Colin had received a Stanhope Foundation Innovation Grant 11 years ago. It was, Marisol had reflected in the months since she began paying close attention, the hinge point, the precise moment where everything that followed had become possible, and therefore, eventually, inevitable. They had been seated for perhaps 25 minutes, drinks poured, conversation moving with the practiced ease of two people who had learned to fill silences correctly when the room changed. Not dramatically. Just a slight collective reorientation of attention, the way a room adjusted when someone arrived who was not expected and could not be ignored. Marisol did not need to look to know. She felt it. She turned slowly. Jenna Harlow was 31 years old, and she had walked into the ballroom in a gown, the color of deep garnet, moving across the marble floor with the confidence of a woman who had rehearsed this entrance. That much was clear in an instant. This was not an accident of scheduling. This was a statement. Jenna had every professional reason to be at a Drummond Medtech corporate table tonight. She had also clearly decided that tonight was the night. She stopped treating it as merely professional. She was striking. Marisol allowed the assessment without drama, the way she assessed most things, accurately, without attachment. Dark hair, sharp jaw, the kind of certainty that read as charisma from across 20 feet of ballroom floor. She had spent considerable effort constructing this entrance, down to the angle of her shoulders. Colin beside Marisol had gone still in the way bodies went still when they were trying not to react. His wineglass stopped halfway to his mouth. He did not look at Marisol. Jenna's gaze moved across the room and found Colin's in under 4 seconds. Something passed between them. The private shorthand of people who had been keeping a secret they no longer wanted to keep, and then Jenna began walking toward their table. The woman to Marisol's right, her friend Francesca Delacroix, who had been mid-sentence about a fundraising project, went quiet. Jenna stopped in front of them. She extended her hand toward Marisol with a smile that was practiced, warm, and just slightly too wide, the smile of someone performing certainty rather than genuinely feeling it. Mrs. Drummond, her voice was smooth. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Jenna Harlow. I work very closely with Colin on the expansion strategy. The table had gone still in the way. Tables went still when everyone understood that what was being said and what was being communicated were two entirely different things. Marisol set down her wineglass with the deliberateness of a woman who chose movement. She looked at Jenna's hand. She looked at Jenna's face. And then she took the hand, shook it once, briefly, and released it with a composure so complete that 3 people watching would later describe it as almost unsettling. Of course, Marisol said. Collins mentioned the expansion team. 5 words, quiet, polite, and containing within them the particular weight of a woman who was not surprised, not wounded. Simply watching something she had already accounted for. Jenna recovered. She was too prepared to be easily rattled. She moved to a nearby table, accepted a drink, and settled in with the practiced composure of someone who had decided in advance that this evening belonged to her. The dinner service came. The Foundation's executive director gave a speech about community impact that was genuinely moving. A short video played showing the programs the Stanhope Foundation funded: a pediatric clinic in Timmins, a trauma unit in Saskatoon, a mobile health van running routes through remote communities in Nunavut. Marisol watched it and felt the quiet, uncomplicated pride that the family's work had always produced in her, separate from everything else. Clean. Francesca leaned close. That woman has been looking at your husband like she's already redecorating. I know, Marisol said. What is happening right now, Marisol? Marisol reached for a piece of bread. Nothing that isn't already finished. Francesca looked at her, the searching look of a long friend trying to read past composure. Whatever she saw there made her nod once and turn back toward her own plate. Across the room, Jenna was laughing at something, her head tilted back just enough, positioned at an angle to Colin that was intimate without being technically inappropriate. Performing, all of it performing, and Colin, God help him, had stopped being careful enough to hide that he was participating. He had leaned twice in her direction when their eyes met. He had allowed the room to become undeniable. She had been watching for this. Not just the affair which she had known about for 3 months, but this specific moment. The moment when a man who was losing his nerve stopped maintaining the performance and forced the situation to resolve itself publicly, because he did not have the courage to end it, honestly and in private. She had recognized the pattern. She had simply waited for it to arrive in a room large enough to matter. At 9:40, Colin stood. He hadn't signaled, hadn't asked for the microphone. He had simply stood, and because he was Colin Drummond, CEO of Drummond MedTech, because his company's name was on the Innovation Award being presented that evening, the room gave him its attention, the way rooms gave attention to men who had learned to command them. I just want to say something. His voice was easy, practiced. Tonight is about courage. The courage to do the work that matters even when it's hard, to be honest with yourself about who you are and what you want, and then to act on it. A pause, his gaze moved briefly but unmistakably toward Jenna's table. I think we could all stand to learn something from that kind of honesty. The ballroom was not applauding. The room had understood in that wordless collective way that rooms understood things, that the speech was not about healthcare workers. Marisol sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine completely straight and her face carrying the expression of a woman who had known this moment was coming and had arranged herself precisely to receive it. Colin sat down. He reached for his wine. He did not meet her eyes. Then, from across the ballroom, a chair scraped back. Jenna Harlow stood. She held her champagne flute. She was smiling, and in her expression was something Marisol recognized with complete clinical precision: premature triumph. The particular brightness of someone who believes the battle is already won because they have not yet seen all the pieces on the board. I'd love to add to that. Jenna's voice carried the way she had clearly practiced it to carry. Warm, ringing, deliberate. To courage, to knowing your own mind. She raised her glass higher. Let her gaze move across the tables, and to new beginnings, wherever they take us. She looked directly at Marisol. She held the look for 4 full seconds, then she drank. No one else raised their glass. No murmur of agreement moved through the room. 500 people. And the only sound was the ghost of Jenna Harlow's voice, dissolving into a silence that was, in its completeness, one of the most suffocating silences Marisol had ever sat inside. Jenna's smile held for 4 seconds. Then, across her face, a first hairline fracture. The beginning of a realization that the room had not responded the way she had expected. Marisol rose. Not quickly, not dramatically. She rose the way women in her family rose, with an unhurried inevitability, the way seasons changed because the motion was simply the next thing that was going to happen, and the room adjusted around it. She set her napkin beside her plate. She smoothed the front of her gown, and then she walked toward the center of the ballroom. Not toward Jenna, not away from Colin. Simply toward the center, with the deliberate calm of a woman who knew exactly what was about to happen, because she had designed it herself. Every eye in the room followed her. And then beyond the ballroom's paired doors she heard it. Footsteps. Multiple, measured, moving with a particular rhythm of people who had decided exactly where they were going and had no intention of being hurried. The doors opened. The first thing you noticed was the stillness he carried. Not the stillness of uncertainty, the stillness of something enormous arriving at a destination it had always been moving toward. Rupert Stanhope walked into the ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York, and 500 people understood, in the wordless way that rooms understood power, that the space they occupied had just fundamentally changed. He was 71 years old, and he moved like a man of 50, and the suit he wore was quiet and very expensive, and he carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who had spent 5 decades being the most consequential person in every room he entered, and had simply never developed the habit of pretending otherwise because it wasn't performance. It was simply what he was. Behind him, Vera Stanhope, silver-haired, wearing pale gray. That was somehow the loudest thing in the room, her gaze moving, comprehensive assessment of a woman with a swift assessment of a woman who had been reading rooms for 40 years and considered it something between a skill and a minor hobby. And beside her, Alistair Stanhope, 40 years old, face carrying the signature family expression of complete, unhurried certainty, stepping into the candlelight with his hands clasped in front of him, and his eyes making one careful, comprehensive sweep of the room. Colin went the color of old plaster. Marisol, standing in the center of the ballroom, did not turn around. She didn't need to. She could see it in Colin's face, the exact moment when the full weight of what he had done, and what he had failed to understand about the woman he had married, arrived. He had thought he was leaving a wife. He had not understood that he was starting a disagreement with a dynasty. And in this city, in this industry, in this specific room whose renovation had been funded by a Stanhope endowment, dynasties did not lose. They didn't have to. They simply arrived, and it was already over. Rupert moved through the parting crowd toward his daughter, and the room made way for him, the way. Rooms made way for things that were simply larger than themselves, not because it was forced to, but because the physics of the situation left no other option. He reached Marisol. He took her hand in both of his briefly and looked at her face with the focused, unhurried attention of a father, reading his child for things she would never say aloud. "We're here," he said quietly. "I know," she said, "right on time." Rupert did not raise his voice, he never had to. He looked at Colin with a particular detached assessment of someone evaluating a problem that was already solved. Not with anger, not with contempt exactly, but with the clarity of a man who had made a decision and was simply waiting for the administrative details to follow. Alistair crossed the room in that particular way he moved, without appearing to hurry, arriving as though he had always been there. He stopped near Colin's table and clasped his hands in front of him with the easy composure of a lawyer who argued before federal courts 3 times a month and had long since stopped finding any room particularly intimidating. "Colin," the word was professionally pleasant. "Alistair," Colin's voice was careful. He was running calculations. You could see it in the slight tension around his jaw. "What are you doing here?" "My sister's name is on the foundation, as is yours still." Alistair let half a second of silence land. "We came to support the evening, and to support Marisol, as we always do." That last sentence was not a pleasantry. Everyone within earshot understood it was not a pleasantry. It was a perimeter being drawn, quietly and precisely, in a room full of people who would carry it out of this building and into the calls and meetings that constituted the real architecture of professional reputation in this city. Jenna Harlow was still standing. She had not sat down when the Stanhopes entered. She held her glass at a slightly lower angle now, her smile technically still present, but beginning to show the structural weakness of something, built on a false assumption. She was looking at Rupert, then at Vera, then at Alistair, running some rapid internal calculation, trying to place these people, trying to understand why the room had shifted so completely. She hadn't done enough research. She had studied Marisol Drummond, the charity boards, the composed public appearances, the graceful 11-year marriage to the man she'd decided she wanted. She had not studied Marisol Stanhope. She had not understood what it meant in the specific architecture of Ontario's healthcare industry to be the eldest daughter of Rupert Stanhope of Stanhope Medical Group, whose signatures were on the operating licenses of 31 facilities, including the 4 that Drummond Medtech's entire Vancouver expansion depended on. She was about to find out. Vera moved. She crossed the room with the ease of a woman who had never found any room particularly intimidating, and stopped at Jenna's table. She looked at Jenna the way she looked at most things. Clearly, without malice, without performance, simply with the directness of someone who had stopped requiring anyone's approval so long ago that the habit had become structural. "I've been watching you since you walked in," Vera said. Her voice was even. It carried just far enough. "What you did tonight, what you thought you were doing," a pause, brief and precise, was mistaking a man's recklessness for power. The two things look alike in a ballroom. They don't look alike in the morning. She turned and walked back to her husband's side. That was all. That was the entirety of Vera Stanhope's engagement with the woman who had stood up in a ballroom and raised a glass toward the destruction of her daughter's marriage. Several people would say, later, that it was the most effective thing anyone said all evening, including the Foundation's executive director. Jenna sat down. The Drummond Medtech colleague who had been seated beside her moved her chair several inches to the left. It was a small movement. In that silence, it was enormous. At a table near the east wall, a hospital board administrator leaned toward her husband and murmured, "Lo, call Rupert's office tomorrow." He nodded without looking at her. These were the small, invisible movements that would begin gathering and accelerating in the days to come. Marisol found her father at the edge of the room. He turned to her fully, giving her complete attention. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We were always going to come." He looked at her face carefully. "Alistair has everything in place. The licensing review request goes to the board at 9 tomorrow morning. The hospital partnership agreements Drummond Medtech is counting on for Q4. Those are contingent on continued Stanhope participation. They will not be continued. And the award he received tonight?" Something moved across Rupert's face. Not quite a smile. The Innovation Award came through. The Foundation Selection Committee. I chaired that committee. I expect the board will find that context useful when questions about judgment arise. She turned once and looked at the room, at Colin at their table staring at a wine glass as though it held information he needed. At Jenna, sitting alone now in her garnet gown, arms close to her body, the performance entirely gone. Her face arranged in the careful blankness of someone calculating an exit. At 500 people who had witnessed something significant and would carry it out into every professional conversation that mattered for months to come. She looked at all of it. She let herself feel it, not with triumph, not with grief, but with the particular clarity that arrived after a long and difficult decision had finally been made and enacted and could not be unmade. Then she turned away. She walked toward her family, and she did not look back. Behind her, she heard Colin say her name, low, stripped of its usual composure. Just Marisol. She kept walking. He said it again. She did not stop, not as punishment, not as a performance, but because there was genuinely nothing left that needed saying, and she had understood that for a long time before tonight. Tonight had simply made it official. Alistair held the door. As she passed him, he said nothing, only looked at her with the expression. That meant he was proud, and that they would talk tomorrow, and that everything was already moving in the direction it needed to move. She walked out of the ballroom, the noise of the room, the hum of conversation reasserting itself, the tentative resumption of an evening that could not quite manage to feel normal, faded behind the closing door. Vera fell into step beside her as they moved through the corridor, their heels making small sounds on the floor. For a few moments neither spoke. "How long did you know?" Vera asked. 91 days. "You said nothing." "I was waiting." "For what, specifically?" Marisol thought about it. About the morning she'd first noticed the garage calls. About the 91 evenings she had made tea and watched Colin move through the kitchen with the particular distraction of a man carrying something he was growing less careful about. About Alistair's call. About Jenna's name appearing on the Foundation's guest list under the Drummond MedTech corporate block. "I was waiting for him to make a choice out loud," she said, "in front of people who would remember it, so there would be no ambiguity. Not for him, not for me, not for anyone who might later have questions about judgment." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precise, understated delivery that was her signature, "He certainly resolved that question." And Marisol in the corridor outside the ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York, away from the 500 people, and the orchid centerpieces, and the candlelight, and the wreckage of an evening that had played out exactly as she had known it, laughed. Briefly and genuinely the way she hadn't laughed in months. Her mother took her arm. They walked. Behind them she could hear her father and Alistair already speaking in the low, efficient shorthand of men who had moved into the operational phase of something and were running through the details. She did not look back again. The morning after the gala, Colin woke to 6 missed calls, 2 from his CFO, 3 from partners at firms he had been cultivating for the Vancouver expansion, 1 from the Stanhope Foundation's executive director at 7:15 in the morning, which was unusual enough that he sat up before he had finished reading the name. He called his CFO first. Drummond MedTech's 2 hospital partnership agreements, the ones that underpinned the entire Q4 revenue model, had been placed under administrative review. The Stanhope Medical Group, it turned out, held quiet participation clauses in both, the kind that could be activated at the discretion of the principal holder. The principal holder had activated them. He called Alistair. Alistair picked up immediately, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't. "Those clauses have been in the agreement since year 1, Alistair said, pleasantly and without preamble. "I drafted them. Standard family capital protection language." "This isn't a reaction to last night, Colin. It's a contractual consequence of decisions made over a considerable period of time. There are 300 employees. Speak to your legal team, or contact my office and schedule a formal conversation." Colin called Marisol voicemail. He sat at his desk in an office that had begun to feel like a room he was borrowing from someone else, and looked at the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, and thought about 11 years and about 300 employees, and about what it meant to have built something real. And then quietly, methodically dismantled the conditions that had been holding it up. Conditions he had taken for granted, because taking them for granted had been so easy and so comfortable for so long. At 10:15, Jenna arrived at the Drummond MedTech offices and found that her access card no longer worked. She pressed it against the reader twice, a third time. Then she turned to the security desk. The guard looked at her with the particular discomfort of someone delivering news they had not asked to deliver. "HR has asked that you wait in the lobby, Ms. Harlow." She waited 27 minutes. The HR director came down with an envelope, and the expression of someone who had done this before and found it uncomfortable every single time. "Your conduct last night was considered a significant breach of professional standards," the director said. combined with concerns raised at the board level regarding certain conduct over the past several months. Concerns raised by whom? By multiple board members. This decision was made at that level. Jenna took the envelope. She walked out of the building into the sharp Toronto morning and stood on the sidewalk with the city moving around her in every direction, and thought about the champagne flute and the words she had rehearsed and the way the room had gone quiet and the particular clarity in Vera Stanhope's voice. She thought about calling Colin. She called. 4 rings, then voicemail. She called again 20 minutes later. 2 rings. He had seen her name and declined it. She put her phone in her bag. She stood on a corner. She had walked past hundreds of times in the specific, clarifying cold of understanding what had actually happened in that ballroom and what she had actually miscalculated and felt for the first time since she had walked through those gilded doors in her garnet gown, certain, prepared, ready to claim what she had decided was already hers, the first real cold edge of what was actually happening. She had not won that night. She had not even competed in the game she believed she was playing. She had walked into a situation she had fundamentally misread and made herself the most visible person in the room at exactly the wrong moment. 6 weeks after the gala, on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, Marisol published an announcement. Not through a publicist, not through a press release. In her own words, posted simultaneously across the Foundation's platforms and her own professional profile, accompanied by the framework document she had been building for 3 months with Dr. Leila Ranganathan, a researcher at the University of Toronto, whose work on women in healthcare leadership Marisol had been quietly following for 2 years. The Stanhope Ranganathan Initiative for Women in Healthcare Leadership, seed funding of $8 million, 12 women, grants of $65,000 each, plus 18 months of mentorship access and placement support. Applications, open in 30 days. Her phone rang at 9:04, Francesca. "I'm standing in my kitchen and I'm actually crying," Francesca said. "Don't. We haven't done anything yet. We've only announced." "Marisol." Francesca's voice was firm in the way of friends who refuse to be redirected. "You know that's not true." Marisol looked out the window of the new office she had signed the lease on 2 weeks earlier, her name alone, on the paperwork. A clean, bright space in a building that carried no history she hadn't chosen. "It feels like the first thing in a long time that is entirely mine," she said. "Good. That's exactly what it should feel like." Her father called at 9:20. "I saw the announcement," he said. A pause. "Your mother is very proud." Another pause, slightly longer. "So am I." He ended the call before she could respond, which was so completely like him that it made her eyes sting briefly and unexpectedly, the way her father's particular form of love had always managed to reach her sideways. She allowed herself that for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the evaluation criteria she had been drafting. Colin read the announcement from the desk of a company being quietly reorganized around its core technology, assets, the surgical navigation software that had always been genuinely, unambiguously his, built from actual intelligence and actual vision, before the scaffolding had become load-bearing in ways he hadn't fully accounted for. He looked at the initiative name, Stanhope Ranganathan, her name, her family's name, no Drummond anywhere in its architecture. He felt something he had not anticipated, pride, genuine and uncomplicated, entirely out of place, in the context of everything he had done to arrive at this morning. He knew what this kind of work required. He had watched her operate for 11 years. He had simply, for too long, not been paying close enough attention to what he was watching. His assistant knocked. "The board has confirmed Thursday at 9. Loretta Oswell is leading the review." He nodded. He looked at the city. He had had one coffee with Marisol, 10 days after the gala. The Hazel Room, early on, a Saturday. She had arrived in dark jeans and a cashmere sweater and had looked more like herself than she had in 2 years. He had told her he was sorry that it was inadequate, that he knew what he had had and what he had done with it. She had looked at him steadily. "I know," she said, not with anger, with the clarity of a woman who had already moved on from a question she no longer needed him to answer. "I loved you," she had said, for a long time genuinely, past tense, quiet, complete. He had sat with that. There was nothing true to say to past tense delivered that cleanly. "What are you going to do?" he had asked. "Build something." And when she said it, her face had changed in a way he recognized, and hadn't seen in years, the look of a person with momentum they had chosen rather than inherited. "Something real, something that belongs to me." She had finished her coffee. She had put on her coat. "Take care of yourself, Colin," she had said, and she had meant it, which was possibly the hardest thing about the entire morning, that she had looked at him and meant it. She had walked out into the October light without looking back. He had sat there for a long time after. Then he had done what he could with what remained. He was smart enough, still, to separate what had always been genuinely his from what had been held up by circumstances he had taken for granted. He brought in a new CFO. He restructured. He was honest with his board, which cost him the room, but earned him, eventually, a kind of grudging respect from the members who decided to stay. He was building something smaller. For the first time in years, he thought it might be more honest. The divorce was finalized on a gray Wednesday in late November. Alistair handled it, as he had promised. Professionally, precisely, without delay. Both sides had agreed that prolonging the process served no purpose. Marisol signed the final documents in the firm's boardroom at 10 in the morning. When she set the pen down, Alistair came around the table and held her briefly, the way siblings, who knew each other, well held each other, when words would only reduce what they were both carrying. She stepped back. She straightened her jacket. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "Always," he said, "just that." She walked out into the gray November morning and stood on the street and felt the specific quality of a thing being finished. Not the dramatic finish of the gala, not the held breath moment of the ballroom doors opening and her father walking through, just the quiet administrative completion of something that had ended, in every real sense, weeks ago. She called her mother. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" Vera asked. Marisol looked up at the winter sky. "Free," she said. The word arrived before she looked for it. "I feel free, Mum." Vera was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had something soft in it, something Marisol only heard occasionally, the voice of a woman before the composure, before all of it. "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." They stayed on the line without speaking for a moment. Then Vera said, "Sunday dinner." And Marisol said, "I'll bring wine," and she put her phone in her pocket and started walking toward the new office, toward the 243 applications already filed for the first cohort, nearly 4 times the number they had projected, toward Dr. Ranganathan, who had left a voice message at 6:30 in the morning that said simply, "Did you see the number? We need more reviewers. Call me." She had seen the number. She was already thinking about exactly that. She walked through the November city with the forward-facing energy of a woman who had closed one chapter so completely, so deliberately, so finally, that she could already feel the shape of the next one forming beneath her feet, not with triumph, not with grief, but with the particular quiet clarity of someone who had done a hard thing correctly and was now ready, without apology or qualification, for everything that came after. Power does not announce itself in ballrooms. It does not raise a glass and wait for a room to confirm it. It builds quietly and with absolute intention until the building is so real and so consequential that the room has no choice but to recognize what was always already there. That was the lesson of that October evening at the Fairmont. That was what Jenna Harlow's champagne toast had triggered, and what Colin Drummond's empire had slowly revealed in its cracking, and what 6 months of deliberate, unhurried work had made permanent. Marisol had not won the night of the gala. She had simply been the only person in that room who already knew how the story ended. And then she had gone home, slept soundly, and gotten up in the morning and built it.